Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today I have two special guests on to talk about Herman Bavinck and different aspects of his thoughts. They come from the Edinburgh Reformation. I've learned from Dr. Eglinton it's not a revolution, it's a reformation, because that's what Bavinck would have said. I also learned it's not Bavinck, but I'm an American swine, so I say Pensées instead of Pensées, and I say Bavinck instead of Bavinck or anything like that. But without further ado, my two guests here are Cory Brock and Gray Sutanto, or you might see Nathaniel Gray Sutanto. But gents, thanks so much for coming on the podcast here.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. So Cory, can I just get you to introduce yourself? What are you up to nowadays since your time at Edinburgh?
Yeah, I live in Jackson, Mississippi with my wife, and we have 4 kids, and I'm an assistant minister at First Presbyterian Jackson. So that's a PCA church. So I pastor full-time, and then I teach part-time at both Belhaven University and recently at RTS Jackson as well.
Awesome, man. Yeah, a lot going on. Yeah, great. How about yourself?
Yeah, thanks. I'm an assistant professor of systematic theology at RTS Washington, ordained in the International Presbyterian Church in the UK, and currently just coming off the first fall semester teaching courses and now grading and examining papers.
Yeah, well, that's some fun stuff. It'll be a fun week or two for you there. So I wanted to have you guys on to talk about your recent work in Herman Bavinck, whatever, and it's super exciting because every so often there's just this Bavinck drop, and you see all this new scholarship coming out. It's awesome. You guys have really been at the forefront of it, especially with the annotated edition of Philosophy of Revelation here, which is just an awesome book. I had the old ghetto version from Amazon, which somebody just copied. It was super weird. And then also Christian Worldview, which I believe this was the first edition from you guys. You guys translated this along with Dr. Eglinton. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. There's multiple editions in the Dutch form, but this is the first English translation of it. Yeah, so it was a very important work, and we thought, man, we need to get this out in the English-speaking world.
Yeah, and so I have a friend who did the cover at Crossway, and he was telling me a little bit about it, and I was like, I don't know, man, like it's so little. He was showing me, and it came out super nice. They did it like the original, or one of the original Dutch versions, like an old school book. But then I read it, and it's this huge work of philosophy. It's amazing, and I did not expect it at all. So we're seriously indebted. The English speaking community is indebted to you guys. It's awesome. It's an awesome book. I hope to get into it later in our conversation here.
Yeah, thanks.
But what we're going to start on is your guys' works, Cory's work, Orthodox Yet Modern, Herman Bavinck's use of Friedrich Schleiermacher, and then also Gray's book, God and Knowledge, Herman Bavinck's Theological Epistemology. So what I noticed in reading these books is that there's some overlap. You guys talk about similar things, though it's definitely from different perspectives. You both talk about Schleiermacher. Gray, I think in chapter 7, you start talking about him. You both talk about Thomas and Neo-Thomism or Thomism. Cory, you mentioned that as well, even though that's more in Gray's part. Was there any collaboration between the two of you? I know you collaborated on these works. Were you collaborating during your dissertation work?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we were working side by side, really, in Edinburgh together at New College together. So Gray and I and James Eglinton and a couple other guys as well were just always in conversation and living life together really for several years. It was
Cory froze up a little bit there. We missed that last part. I think he said Gray's better at Dutch than him. I'm not sure. Is that what? You missed it.
That's what I said. Exactly.
Yeah. Actually, I did have a question about that. Who out of the crew, who's the best at Dutch?
James.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
well, he did live in Holland for 3 years, so I think he learned how to pick up basically speaking Dutch there on a day-to-day basis.
Okay.
And I think there's nothing that could replace that. We hope one day that we can live an extended time in Holland, but right now it's mostly reading ability. But yeah, to your question, Parker, I don't know what Cory said at the end there, but Cory's was actually the first one to get to Edinburgh.
Hmm.
I mean, he did a master's degree there first before he did this PhD there. So it was one of the first. Well, he was the first Bavinck student under James there, and then I came on, I think, in Cory's second year, and for about a year and a half or so, it was just us two working together with James before other people came in, like Bruce Pass, I think, was the third person. So it was a very tight knit, close, Bavinck community in Edinburgh that is now growing. I think there's about 5 or 6 people there now working on Bavinck together there. So yeah, I and Cory, even the philosophy of revelation work, I think, came out of a conversation in the Edinburgh kitchen, where we were like, in line, probably getting the hot water there or something, and then we just said, we need to produce something that could be easily accessible to a lot of people there. So yeah, definitely close collaboration.
Man, that's awesome. So I alluded to it in the opening about the Edinburgh Reformation. And I've seen you guys from afar. I've seen you on Reform Forum. I've read your books and stuff like that. It seems like you guys are working your way through every facet of Bavinck. Is that intentional? Has that just kind of come out? Was this something that Dr. Eglinton kind of planned on, or is this kind of an accident of history? Well, yeah, fill us in.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a part of it was accidental, but a part of it was also necessitated by the fact that when you're writing a doctoral thesis, right, you had to actually carve out space where this is a unique contribution on your part. And but we had a very collaborative effort as well, because, as we're getting to know one another, as we are, I and Cory working on really separate facets of Bavinck's epistemology, right? We were able to say, okay, what can we focus on that would complement one another without getting into a kind of, competitive spirit, which sometimes could happen in the academy, right? So, but yeah, definitely very exciting. I mean, Cory's work, of course, on Bavinck's use of Schleiermacher, and my work on epistemology. And then there's also, Bruce Pass that talked about Bavinck's relation to lots of the German theological movements as well, and about Christology particularly. And then you have Cam Clausing, who's working on Doctrine of God and Bavinck's use of history in the context of the 19th century as well. Then you have someone like a Greg Parker right now who's working on Bavinck's ethics, I believe. So definitely wanting to work on different things, but at the same time complementing each other's works.
Yeah. That's awesome. Cory, when you came in, did you plan on looking at Bavinck's use of Schleiermacher, or did that hit somewhere along the line?
No, I didn't know exactly. I knew I wanted to work in Dutch theology when I got there, and that came about just from a lot of time reading the text and a lot of searching and reviewing. But no, I did not know. It was something I came to over my course of just the first year of being over there.
Okay. That's awesome. So before we get too much further in, there's a couple just introductory things that we should talk about. One is, who is Herman Bavinck, for someone who just stumbled upon this podcast, and what are his dates? Can one of you guys, or both of you guys, who was he, and when do we locate him at?
But his dates are 1854 to 1921. He's Dutch. He was born, raised in the Netherlands, lived in the Netherlands his whole life. He's at the peak of a turn from pre-modernity to modernity, if you will, in the 19th century, and then crossing the border of the 20th century. So he's just kind of a man who lived in times that were changing rapidly. But yeah, 1854 to 1921 are his days. He dies in late July of 1921.
Okay. Well, I think what's so interesting about Bavinck is that it seems like he kind of got lost for like 100 years, and then he's showing back up through, largely through your guys' work over there in Edinburgh, and he's right back in the conversation, and it's applicable. And even though it's old, it's new, which is amazing. And I think a big part of that is the organic motif, which Dr. Eglinton kind of started showing that there's not two Bavincks, there's not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde Bavincks, but there's one unified Bavinck who is eclectic in his thought because of this organic motif. And so I thought maybe we could just jump in on the orthodox yet modern understanding of Bavinck. It sounds like, just from the title, sounds like, James Eglinton did all this work to unify Bavinck, and then Cory comes along and he's saying, no, he's Orthodox and modern. And there's two, I know you're not doing that. Cory, can you explain to us how this is your whole your whole dissertation? Can you just briefly sum up your dissertation for us? How do you mean Bavinck is Orthodox yet modern?
Yeah, sure. So what we mean by those terms is that Bavinck is Orthodox in that he's very typically a son of a secessionist free church background. Mm-hmm. So he upholds the three forms of unity, adheres to the ecumenical creeds. He lives a Protestant work ethic lifestyle. He's a Sabbatarian in all of those ways. So, but what James helped us understand was that a lot of times in the past, people had looked at Bavinck's corpus and they had looked at different texts in Bavinck's corpus and noticed at times you see a very confessional, a Reformed scholastic, exactly what you might expect. And then on the other hand, there are times in Bavinck's corpus where he's interacting with modern philosophy and modern theologies in a pretty surprising way. What James helped us understand is, unlike previous thinkers, there aren't Bavinck's not a dualistic thinker. There are not these moments where all of a sudden he's switched into his modernist impulse. That he's consistently Orthodox and modern. What I was trying to show was that he is Orthodox yet modern, in that he is willing to use a thinker like Friedrich Schleiermacher in positive appropriation to adopt even some of the thoughts of Schleiermacher into his own corpus, and that remain in the domains of his confessional boundaries, if you will. So, Gray, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think how our works complement one another is that we try to take those texts in face value, basically. So we say, if Bavinck is using Orthodox sources here, then show us how he's doing that. But at the same time, when he uses someone like a Schleiermacher or a German idealist or a post-Kantian romantic philosopher, a mediating theologian, we don't take a look at that and say, wait a minute, he just said this about the Orthodox guys. How does that fit into what he's saying here? It doesn't seem to fit. We just take that as face value and say, okay, in Bavinck's own mind, he sees these moves and these uses of these different thinkers as compatible in some way. So with that kind of hermeneutic of charity rather than hermeneutic of suspicion, I think that's the kind of basic modal shift that helped inform how we read Bavinck after that.
Yeah, that's so helpful. I first read any part of the dogmatics in my first year of seminary here, 2018 or something like that, and Dr. Van Hooser required volume 2 for his course. We read all through volume 2. Some of us in the class were just blown away. Others were totally over their head. A lot of the folks who were really good with the languages had a really hard time with Bavinck, even though he's got languages in there, but the deep, rich philosophy and theology. And actually reading Bavinck helped me understand Dr. Van Hooser's work, where, as you guys know, if you've read his work at all, he pulls from everyone. And I'm like, who is this guy? What does he actually believe? What's going on here? And I saw a similar vein that, Bavinck was doing it as well. It's an organism. He's saying there's truth all over the place. I don't have to be a Schleiermacherian in order to appreciate a bit of insight from him. So I thought that was really helpful, even in appreciating my own professor. Something I found really interesting, Cory, in your work is that you said that Bavinck cites Augustine more than Calvin, which I thought was really, really interesting. What's the significance there? I thought maybe since he's a Reformed theologian, he's going to really be showing that he's in step with Calvin. Why do you think that he went out of his way to cite Augustine more so?
Well, I mean, it's a similar idea to what we were just talking about. Number one, Bavinck was eclectic, and like the Reformers, I mean, it's not even being eclectic. Like the Reformers, he wanted to show that the doctrines of grace and all the other doctrines of Reformed Protestant theology are patristic doctrines on the one hand, but he definitely saw Augustine as the great theologian of history, and I mean, he says that quite clearly in the Reformed Dogmatics. And he sees a tight lineage, of course, between Augustine and Calvin. But Augustine is the father for him of Christian theology and history. So yeah, it is the case that there are significantly more, several hundred more citations of Augustine across the Reformed dogmatics, with Calvin coming in second. Schleiermacher is not far down that list. He's fifth or sixth most cited, and that's not always the most significant thing. These statistics, of course, 90+% of the Schleiermacher references, for example, are very critical and very negative, and very, very highly critical of his material dogmatics in particular. But it is the case that Augustine is premier. Bonaventure is another that's really significant across the corpus of Bavinck's dogmatics, as well as Aquinas and several others. So.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Another question for both you guys. So it's called Reformed Dogmatics. His probably his magnum opus. Maybe it's not, but I think it's probably his magnum opus. Reformed Dogmatics, and yet Berkouwer in his memoir described Bavinck his task as Catholicity. So to me initially, and maybe to some others, it seems kind of paradoxical that this dude could be striving for Catholicity and then name his magnum opus Reformed Dogmatics. Can you guys explain how his project, Cory, you've been explaining it, but how can he be a Reformed dogmatician and yet be striving for Catholicity?
Go ahead, Greg.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that's a great question, Parker. I think, right now we're in greater awareness that Reformed theology is actually a Catholic theology, Catholic in the small c, with a retrieval projects of someone like a Scott Swain and a Mike Allen. We're very aware that Reformed theology is always drawn from the patristics and medieval insights, right? And Bavinck says that very explicitly, not only in his preface to the first edition of the Reformed Dogmatics, where he says we have to draw from the great thinkers of the past, but also in other works like The Catholicity of Christianity and the Church, where he would say things like, we must not only draw from the past thinkers, but we should also draw from the present contemporary thinkers. Namely, he really has this conviction that if you really believe in a broad Catholicity, then you have to believe that Catholicity extends not only to the past, but also to the present. And that's a huge mode of understanding of his own work, I think, for Bavinck. So, and that might actually strike readers as quite new, because Catholicity is always talked about in reference to the past, but not yet to the present. But Bavinck applies clearly to both.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, one pithy way, I think, quick way of saying it is that Bavinck was a universalizer. He always was going broad rather than narrow, and part of that was to for him search for God's truth wherever it could be found. It didn't matter who the author was, as long as he could find truth. And for him, revelation is ubiquitous. He extends the domain of general revelation in particular in his corpus, and in doing that, he finds so much more value in broader study and willingness to interact with sources that one wouldn't commonly interact with coming from his context, precisely because of his adherence to this concept of Catholicity. That Catholicity is an attitude, but it's a reality as well of the fact of God's revelation to the world and of the church's scope. And in so many ways, this idea of the Catholic and the universal kind of cohere in both how we act and think and write and interact and in so many ways for him. So,
yeah, and that's such a huge lesson, I think, that we need today as well. We can still be Reformed, we can still be Calvinistic, we can still have convictions, but we should also, the church is universal, and God has his people in all sorts of different denominations. And that's something that I want to learn from Bavinck. I want to be firm in my convictions, and I want to extend olive branches where I can. And I want to, I want to be unified, like Christ says his church will be. And I think that's something so fantastic about Bavinck, who held such strong convictions and yet could appropriate even from Schleiermacher, which is kind of crazy. I'm scared to do that, right?
Well, you see this too in his own lifetime. One of the things that he and Abraham Kuyper were trying to do was to join two different denominations, and there was a massive quarrel about that and debates about that in the 1880s and 1890s, and Bavinck appealed to the Catholicity of the faith to say that even within Reformed theology, that we need to have a broad Reformed ecclesiology that include two different denominations that were existing alongside each other at the time in the Netherlands. And in 1892, Bavinck's denomination, his tradition, his free church background joined with another separatist tradition from the National Church of the Netherlands to join a new denomination in 1892. So you see that even playing out for him at the ecclesiological level, and what he was pushing for and fighting for as an elder of the church.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point. And from reading Dr. Eglinton's work, from listening to you guys on various podcasts, it seems like Bavinck's his focus on Christianity and the Catholicity may have even increased as the Dutch were receiving Nietzsche's work, and he was focusing more on Christianity. Is that true? Have I misinterpreted that? Do you guys see a shift and a broadening in Bavinck's scope, or has it been there the whole time, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that, James's biography particularly has shown that Bavinck, alongside with his works on Reformed theology and Calvinism, started to focus as well on defending Christianity as a whole, that the Christian faith is the broad and capacious vision of life and reality that is in direct contrast to a kind of Nietzschean holistic nihilism that you would get to the turn to the 20th century, right? So I think that's definitely the case. And also just in his philosophical and apologetic interests, he wanted to show the relevance of the Christian faith in all areas of life very clearly. So, he did works on pedagogy, works on adolescence, works on classical education, social relationships, ethics, and so on. At the later end of his career, I think that's part of his desire to show that Christianity continues to make claims about public realities and is continually relevant despite the challenges of modernity and also of nihilism.
Yeah, that's so huge. What a gigantic figure. So crazy because, I mean, I got his essays too, and he's got essays on psychology, and he's got it all over the map. He's just this polymath of a dude who, I would say he's very, very philosophical, but he's very rigorous and very theological as well, to get into all aspects of the human personality, human psyche, which he also incorporates these modern terms, as Cory, you showed in your work, of self, subject, ego, consciousness, which are very a modern understanding of the self, and that's where he starts to appropriate from Schleiermacher and Schleiermacher's modernity. I'm a Van Tillian, as Gray, I love me some Van Til, and I will quote him in any paper I can. I have to quote C.S. Lewis, and I have to quote Van Til. And I quoted something from Defense of the Faith, and it was, for man, self-consciousness presupposes God consciousness. And I cited Van Til, and on the notes, Dr. McCall wrote Schleiermacher. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about, dude. That's clearly Van Til. But I got that, third hand from Bavinck's appropriation of, and Van Til trying to follow in Bavinck's lead.
That's right.
Greg or Cory, can you explain to us that idea of self-consciousness and God consciousness as Schleiermacher, put it?
Yeah, sure. Well, on the one hand, self-consciousness is just an immediate awareness of oneself as a self, as an I. So the term immediate there is being used to signify that one does not form a syllogism every time they need to be aware that I have an ego, that there's identity that is at the base of all my actions, of all my thoughts, of all my speech. We do not think that into existence. It is not the case that I think, therefore I know I am. No, it's that I am, and I am thinking all the time. And there is an immediate intuition, an immediate consciousness of me being me. And what Bavinck saw in Schleiermacher, in the notion of immediate self-consciousness, is a big emphasis on the givenness of the self, contra other Enlightenment expressions of where the self comes from. So, for example, without getting into the details of this, because it's quite difficult, but Kant, as Schleiermacher critiqued Kant, as Bavinck critiqued Kant, as many have critiqued Kant, lost the self in the midst of consciousness. And the self became for Kant an illusion, like God, because the self is not an object of the senses, because the self can't be touched or tasted or felt in some kind of empirical way. Kant really gave up the self to an illusion, like he gave up both the concepts of God and the world. Well, Bavinck, as he says in Philosophy of Revelation very famously, it was Schleiermacher and not Kant that gave us a better sense of the self, not of autonomy, but of dependence. So with Schleiermacher, the early way of saying this, the easiest way of saying this is that Schleiermacher helped Bavinck see in a modern grammar, in a modern philosophical grammar, that there are good philosophical reasons for talking about how the self is given, it's received, it's not thought, or it's not autonomous, it's not an illusion. And of course, Bavinck had a reason. He said, well, I can tell you exactly why that is. It's because the self comes from God. It's the gift of God. And actually, Bavinck wants to go on from Schleiermacher's grammar of the immediate self-consciousness and move into how we can actually open up our concepts of general revelation, subjective general revelation, with this concept of immediate self-consciousness, of the givenness of the self, that there's actually a common operation of the spirit in that reality. So I can keep going about this for way too long, so I'm going to stop.
No, that's so great. And Gray, you talked a little bit about that I think in your later chapters in your own work about the unconscious and God's revelation there. I wanted to ask you guys, how does that relate with the sensus divinitatis? Does Bavinck put Schleiermacher's understanding of self-consciousness and dependence in conversation with I'm sure he probably did, the sensus, right? He's a good Calvinist himself. What do you guys, anything pop up in your heads there?
Yeah, definitely. I think the clearest statement of this is in his chapter on general revelation and the wonderful works of God, where he very clearly says Calvin's sense of the divine is the feeling of dependence, which is just wonderful as a very clear statement there. And this is another thing we try to bring to bear too, is that we got to read the Reformed dogmatics alongside and in light of his later works as well. And I think it's wonderful works of God. He tries to really distill down the essence of his mature dogmatic reflections there. And he says that very clearly. And the feeling of dependence as the sense of the divine, I think, goes really well with what Calvin says, which is that it is not a doctrine first learned in school. It is something that we've mastered from our mother's womb, that even though we try all of our best to suppress, it is never gone. Now, that's a little bit different than what Plantinga says. Plantinga says because of the fall, the sense of the divine can be faulty, can be malfunctioning, could actually not work at all, because it's purely a capacity that triggers.
Yeah, it's like your eyes or something. Your eyes can go bad, your ears can go bad, your sense of the divine can go bad.
Right, exactly. And I think for Calvin and Schleiermacher, what Bavinck sees, this is Bavinck's view, is that it is an ever-present intuition that is the precondition for any possibility of knowing or thinking at all. So I think what came out in our reading is that for Bavinck, general revelation, primordially in the subjective self, is that pre-categorical intuition of the world and God. So by pre-categorical, that's a very technical term. It's a post-Kantian term that says that the intuitions from the world that are bare, that are in Kant's own thought, to be categorized by the categories of the mind. What Schleiermacher and Bavinck does is that they isolate that intuition, the givenness that the categories work with, and they say that's the life of the unconscious. And unconsciously, we are always aware of God, just as we're always aware of the world. And I think that's incredibly helpful, that to bring to bear the riches of the classical Reformed faith to the very post-Kantian discourse of the unconscious life, the psychological life that is prior to explicit cognition.
Well, let me add to that too, because that what Gray just said there is exactly why Bavinck likes the term from Schleiermacher, feeling, Gefühl, because feeling there does not mean emotion, which is a common mistake that people make. But a feeling is the word that Schleiermacher wants to use to describe the intuition of an imperceivable object. So God cannot be seen with the eye, physical eye. The world cannot be seen either. You can't see the world, the totality of existence, what they mean by that, nor can you see the self. So self, world, and God are not objects of physical perception.
Yeah.
Right. But from the earliest time as a child, as the Psalms put it, when the baby goes to mother's breast, they start to awaken as their self-consciousness awakens, they begin to awaken to both the fact of themselves and the fact of relative dependence on another human being. In that, the feeling of absolute dependence awakens. And that feeling is the intuition of an imperceivable dependence on absolute existence, on something that is totally not creaturely.
Yeah.
Right. And it's important to make that note that feeling here is not about your emotions, but it's a philosophical term in this discussion that fills in the gap of the imperceivable.
That's really helpful. That note on feeling and also the child analogy, so helpful. And those three transcendentals that got me in trouble when I was trying to think through this before, because I thought, well, okay, so Bavinck is using transcendental language. He's using the three transcendentals from Kant, but Kant said we didn't have knowledge, as you guys said earlier. We didn't have knowledge of these three things. Bavinck, in turning to Schleiermacher, says we do have knowledge of these things. Let me think. So Cory, you talked about like an immediate and a temporal consciousness or knowledge. Is the knowledge of God mediated, or do we have knowledge of God in virtue of our identity, that we're made in His image, so we have it immediately, or does it still come through some kind of our senses? Yeah. What do you think about that?
So what's immediate in this discussion is the self-consciousness, not the experience of God, if you will.
Okay.
So of course, what's immediate is without any other mediation, I know I am being I, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everything I do, the ego, my identity is coming forth. So in immediate self-consciousness, we experience the feeling of absolute dependence, mediated. We know this theologically. It's mediated by general revelation, by God's condescension, by God's determining to come into the world and to give life to me, right? So my self-consciousness in every moment is being upheld by the work of the Holy Spirit, right? And that is being mediated by God's condescended revelation, right? Of course, there's no immediate knowledge of God in the typical sense of dogmatic theology, right? We can't have an immediate knowledge of God as God is in Himself.
Yeah.
But that's mediated by His condescended revelation. But in this discussion of self-consciousness, what is immediate is consciousness of self. That's what's immediate. And then that experience of consciousness of self, that we are awoken to the feeling of absolute dependence on a holy other.
And so is it then like a reflexive knowledge that once you reflect on the fact that you are an I, you realize that I must be dependent on something greater than myself?
Right. And so there's both relative and absolute dependence, right? Relative dependence happens when baby comes to mother. When I see you guys, I'm experiencing a moment of the self-consciousness of relative dependence. Because in this moment, I cannot be what I am as a podcast participant without you, right? I'm dependent. Schleiermacher turns this into a very rational proof for the existence of God as well. I mean, it's not only, he doesn't leave it in the domain of feeling and intuition. He says that's where it begins and it awakens, and it's a fact there.
Yeah.
But also, he turns it into, I mean, it's a proof for the existence of God by terms of causation as well. All of us in relative dependence are given. We're all given self.
Yeah.
Nobody is thinking their self up. Nobody has brought themselves forth, right? We have to absolutely depend on some absolute.
I love that so much, and I think I think it does relate with Van Til's transcendental argument. I actually think this is what Descartes was trying to do, although I don't like the way he did it. But he, in talking about the cogito, he said, I think therefore I am, and then immediately he goes into his ontological proof, talking about, well, I didn't exist, necessarily, so there must be something like me that I depend on. And it's interesting trying to think through, because I inherited this view of Descartes that he's the boogeyman, and in looking through him through kind of these different lenses, seeing what was he really trying to say? Maybe still the boogeyman. But Gray, this gets into some more of your epistemology about awareness and interpreting Herman Bavinck. Was he a proto-reformed epistemologist? What do you think about the immediate awareness of God, or the knowledge of God in the senses? Like, how are you thinking through this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first of all, to your Descartes comment, I think if you imbibe Bavinck's spirit enough, nobody becomes a boogeyman. I think that's what's so refreshing about Bavinck is that, and that's the thing we're trying to recover with this orthodoxy at modern thing. We're trying to say that for Bavinck, literally no one is a boogeyman, whether you're talking about Plato or Kant. He says no one gets a priority and no one is outside of the bounds here. We can actually use everyone because of God's general revelation and common grace. So that's incredibly refreshing. So with regard to the awareness of God and also of Bavinck in relation to the Wolterstorff and Plantinga, I try to show that there's definitely some commonality. And this is also in touch with what Cory was just saying just now. If you take Bavinck's view of general revelation producing that pre-conscious feeling and awareness of relative and absolute dependence, then what you get is that the proofs of God's existence might be helpful, but they're not necessary for you to articulate how it is that people already know God, right? So in other words, people know God apart from rational argumentation. People know God apart from conscious cognitive reasoning. There's this feeling that undergirds it all, that is the starting point for all. Now, the difference with Wolterstorff and Plantinga, apart from that structural similarity, is that for Wolterstorff and Plantinga, because you're drawing so much from Thomas Reid, I don't think they can get behind a propositional understanding of the knowledge of God. In other words, for them, the sense of divinitatis is triggered by particular experiences of the outside world, and then lo and behold, there's suddenly a properly basic belief that there is such a thing as God.
Yeah.
All right. But how do they justify? How do they define, a properly basic belief? Well, it's a warranted true belief. It's a warranted true belief given externalist conditions obtained. For Bavinck, however, here's the kicker, I think, for a lot of analytic guys, is that for Bavinck, there is such a thing as non-propositional knowing. And this is really difficult to uphold. And I've actually tried to show in other works that Heideggerian language is useful here, that in our embodied awareness, there is a non-conceptual awareness of things that is yet not blind, right? And Heidegger's understanding, would be the example of the chess master who intuitively knows what to do apart from knowing exactly how he got there. It's you when you're thinking about your philosophy paper, but you're driving without thinking about it, and then you got home without even being aware that you got home, right? Your body knows things in such a way where even if your mind is completely somewhere else, you are aware of what you're doing in a teleological way, in a non-blind way. And so what Bavinck what starts to emerge then is that the awareness of God is this unconscious given that could be very much present even if your mind is thinking about something else, right? And so that gives us a more romantic picture. I try to argue in that chapter on Wolterstorff and Plantinga. It gives us a much more romantic and German inspired, to be frank, understanding of why it is that awareness of God is a given rather than something that is Redian in the Plantingian Walterstorff sense, where you're triggered by something and then you believe in God suddenly, right? So that is more of a, to use an analogy, Walterstorff and Plantinga's view is more like there's a thunderstorm and then you hear lightning and then you believe in God. Whereas Bavinck and Schleiermacher's, it's more like you're swimming in the middle of the ocean and you can't get rid of the water around you.
Yeah. I like that a lot. I think it does make sense with the the phenomenon of Scripture. Romans 1, we suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Creation is continued. We're swimming in this creation. We ourselves are creation, and we're continually trying to push that back down. No. I don't want to think about that. Yeah.
Well, and some people have struggled a little bit with how much Bavinck does downplay the traditional proofs in the Reformed dogmatics, but I think it's helpful in what Grace just said. And all of this that we've been talking about really comes together to know that there's a philosophical grammar that's underlying his reasons for downplaying the traditional proofs. And really, the philosophy that Gray's talking about right there makes so much sense of the whole picture of the trends of the Dutch theologies in general and modernity.
Yeah.
And Bavinck is at the center of really articulating that early philosophy, that early epistemology, and what that needs to look like. So,
man, that's so helpful. So, Gray, moving more into your work. So we've already mentioned a little bit about the planning a debate and stuff like that. Where can we fit Bavinck? You talked about a classical realism versus like a modernism versus a naive realism. Where do you finally put him? So he's got this organic motif, which allows him to pick and choose what he thinks is true from all different systems. Are we able to place him somewhere? Where do you place him?
Yeah, I think, well, there's two comments maybe to say. First is that contrary to popular belief, especially in Reformed evangelical thought, which I think watered down this very much, is that there's multiple kinds of realisms, just as there's multiple kinds of idealisms, right? Yeah. People think as the realism versus idealism thing as like two poles on the opposites of one another, when really you take a look at the literature, and Joshua Ryan Ferris, which you might be aware about, who's working on retrieving Berkeleyan idealism, there's an argument there that Berkeleyan idealism is a kind of hyper-realism as well, because you're constantly in touch with the thoughts of God, right? And then on the other hand, in realism, there is naive realism, which says that the mind doesn't do anything to your contact with the world. I would actually put probably Thomas Reid there, because concepts don't mediate things. Concepts are just your knowledge of the thing in itself. And then there's critical realism that says that the mind does play a role in influencing, constructing the knowledge that you have of reality, but at the same time it still accesses reality. And then in the idealist perspective, those are just two kinds of realism. There's more, but in the idealist perspective, there's subjective idealism, where ficta fits, where your knowledge of the world is really just willed by you in the kind of existential moment. Maybe the existentialist, the classical existentialist we think about, like Jean-Paul Sartre, maybe we could fit him there too. And then there's absolute idealist, where you have someone like a Hegel, and then you also have what I try to show in my work, an empirical idealist, which you're thinking to yourself, an empirical idealist, that doesn't make any sense. I thought an empiricist is necessarily realist. Where you have a lesser known figure like Edward von Hartmann, who says that you take your sense perception for granted. But how is it that your sense perception can perceive the world? Well, it's because yourself and the world participate in a greater reality, namely this unconscious absolute. So there's just multiple kinds. And it's almost like some idealists are talking about realism through different language, right? And so you got to really parse these things out. And so that's the first thing to say, the complexity of it all. The second thing to say is what Bavinck himself says, which is in Philosophy of Revelation, chapter 3, where he actually argues against naive realism, which he calls naive naturalism there, this idea that your perceptions just perceive the thing in itself without any kind of mediation on the one hand, and subjective idealism on the other. So he says that his view is in between naive realism on the one hand and subjective idealism on the other. And so in this middle ground, you can use someone like an Edward von Hartmann, who says that you participate in a greater whole, and that's why you can know the thing. You can also use someone like an Aristotle, who says that you can know things because of this correspondence between you and the thing, right? But then you could also use lots of other thinkers in between that doesn't compromise the fact that you can know the thing, but at the same time, there is a working of the mind that influences your knowledge of the thing. And there's so many thinkers you can use, as long as you don't compromise those two poles, you want to say, with Bavinck.
Yeah.
So I don't want to identify him with just one particular thinker, but as long as that thinker doesn't compromise those two poles, he would freely use it. That's basically what we have to say. Yeah.
So I've noticed that a lot of philosophers and Christian philosophers want to call everyone a critical realist. C.S. Lewis, he was a critical realist. Just toss them all in there. I don't want to do that with Bavinck, but it seems like that position between those two poles of naive realism and subjectivism is kind of a critical realism, because Bavinck is allowing a place for the categories. There is mediation going on, but you do actually get to, what do you say? You get to the thing in itself, the ding and tick?
Yeah, definitely. That somehow, though the categories of the mind does influence your perception of the thing, it still represents the thing in itself, and so you have access to it. And so, but the thing is, what Bavinck also says in numerous places is that if you don't have theological categories of organism, of Trinity, then critical realism falls apart. Then you can't account for the gap. Why is there a gap? How do I cross the gap? How do I have faith that my representations represent the thing in itself? We don't know. We can't know unless we have a theology that undergirds why it is the case.
Yeah, I noticed that in reading like Donald Davidson and some other people who are arguing against like correspondence, stuff like that, because they think that this gap leaves room for skepticism, and that's because they're not Christians. That's right. If you have this gap there, why is there a gap? How do you know what's on the other side of the gap if you don't have a theological reason we've been made this way? Plantinga goes that route, but then he wants to say, no, there's direct awareness, and then comes into the kind of problems that you brought up earlier. I love the organic motif because of its relevance here. Can you explain how the organic motif is a theological category that helps us hold on to the gap and hold on to realism, and Cory, as well, as it informs your work as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the things that I suggest in my own work is that if you go with the Thomas Reid route, I think the organic motif becomes unnecessary to account for how you know things, because you get rid of the gap, right? There's this awareness of the thing in itself. You don't need to account for the bridging of the gap, so to speak, because in Reid's work, you just know the thing. And as long as you have good faculties that work, however you want to account for that, maybe he does want to go to the existence of God there. But you don't need this organic motif where there's an organic linking between the representations and the thing in itself, right? That you would get in Bavinck. I think the reason why Bavinck wants to use the organic motif is because he wants to say that there is a gap, but there's a way to bridge the gap, namely by organism. And why is there an organic link between the two of you? Because the whole world is shaped in this organic way, where things are diverse realities. They're linked to one another. They're connected to one another. You see that ethically, because you're all connected to Adam as a federal head. You see that in your families, because your family is involved in one another. You see that epistemologically, when you know things that are different from you, and yet at the same time, these categories in your mind can mediate truly the things outside of yourself. So the organic motif presupposes the existence of gaps, but yet at the same time, there's a way to overcome these gaps.
Well, and that's why he says very quite often that faith is at the ground of all knowing. That there's a faith that everybody has to take hold of to know anything, to endeavor out your front door, and to assume that subject and object are in some real relationship. But to put it real simply, he says that the Logos is the maker and mediator of both subject and object, and that there's a gap, and the answer is that the Son of God mediates the knowing activity of the knower and the fact of the objective world outside of them, and unites them organically at all times. It's an operation of common grace, and that means that the self and knowledge are both gifts of God given in God's common grace to the world. So,
it's so exciting. I love it so much. I got into Kant and I thought, this seems right. This seems like we do have some categories of understanding going on, but I want to know the thing in itself. When I reach out to grab a book, I want to know that it's actually a book and it's not like this snake, but my categories interpret it as a book. It's crazy. And Bavinck provided that organic motif, which makes sense of it. And Ronald Nash, he tried to do this with Gordon Clark back in the day and say that Gordon Clark had this preformation theory, that we were preformed for the world. And so the reason we have holes in our mind for square pegs, and we have square pegs out there that we can put in, was because we were preformed. And Clark said no. But really, Bavinck is saying that we live in this organic whole. We've been made for this world, and this world's been made for us. We all fit together, and it gets me all excited because Hume criticized Berkeley or one of the dudes, and saying, we don't live in this mechanistic world. Maybe we live in maybe the world's like a giant carrot. And then after reading Bavinck, I go, yeah, that's right. It's a big old organic carrot. We're like an organic thing. That's not scary anymore, Hume. Like, it actually makes sense of the subject and object relation because we live in an organ, because the universe is an organism made within unity and diversity, like the ad intra unity and diversity. And that's something that I get from you guys. Cory, I don't know if I found a statement of it, in your work, in Dr. Eglinton's work, in Gray's work. It's like Trinity ad intra leads to organic knowing ad extra, right? Cory, did you have one, Cory, or can you come up with one for us right now?
You mean a little pithy organic?
That's right.
No. I just stood on the grounds of the one James already wrote, and what I did was do it more of on a theological method dictum that says that that Bavinck is orthodox yet modern, that there's no getting outside of that domain at this point. Those are the categories one now has to work in.
Yeah.
So that's what I tried to establish. So.
Yeah, we did a great job on that.
Yeah, another thing to say too to that, Parker, is that with Bavinck's approach, and Cory, I wonder what you think about this too. I think he was actually quite ad hoc and pragmatic about it. I think he's saying, given these post-Kantian conditions, here's what we can say, given our theology, given our Trinitarianism. And I think what you start to do therefore with Bavinck is that you never reject a particular new movement. You actually say, how can I use my theological categories to speak into this new philosophical movement with its own philosophical grammar under its own terms oftentimes. And so if another movement came about epistemologically, I think Bavinck would probably do the same, but something different in correspondence. Like if he were around today and he was seeing, I think, analytic theology and analytic philosophy, he would try to speak into that too, using analytic categories and terms as well. And I think if you don't have this organic way of seeing things as Catholicity that Bavinck has, what you're going to end up doing is say, man, Kant is really doing something different, and we just got to go back.
Yeah.
We just got to reject everything here for the last 150 years or so in Bavinck's own day and go back to 17th century, 14th century, whatever, or ancient world, right? Philosophy. You want to just retrieve stuff from there. And I think what Bavinck would say is you're cutting yourself off from the modern milieu. You're cutting yourself off from the riches of God's common grace, even in the present day. And that's such a relieving and open and freeing way, I think, of doing theology and philosophy. It's really exciting.
Well, that's why dogmatics has to be rewritten for each generation, because it needs to be in the grammar of the day, answering the questions of the day. And there was a conference some time ago asking, is Bavinck's dogmatics for today? And I think if Bavinck was around to answer that question, he would say in a way, no, it's a model. And of course, insofar as we're going to absolutely uphold the confessional truths that he upholds theologically, yes, but what he's given us is a model of a theological method for as we construct dogmatics in our own time. So I agree with that.
Well, so Cory, on that note, and Gray, Dr. Eglinton wanted to ground the organic motif in Reformed theology, going back to Calvin. And I wrote a review of it, and I said, that was probably his weakest argument. of the book. His argument is full of strong arguments, and I wrote it from a call. I had to write something negative. Was the organic motif something that I think you guys are probably gonna say no. Was that something that came along that he appropriated from the post-Kantians, or was that did he appropriate the language in order to make sense of a reformed thing? Can you guys explain that for the audience?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the language of it came from a post-Kantian, it's idealist context. It's pretty much ubiquitous. So any post-Kantian idealist, romantic, even someone like a Schleiermacher, you take a look at his speeches, he talks about the organic world, the organic self all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go to Eduard von Hartmann, again, the German absolute empiricist idealist. He uses it all the time. So it's ubiquitous in the 19th century. And then Kuyper uses it ubiquitously. I mean, you can't turn a page in Kuyper where he doesn't talk about something organic versus something mechanical. And I think what Kuyper and Bavinck were up to is basically to say, hey, there's a lot of good here in these romantic ways of talking about the organic. Can we look back in our own Reformed confessional heritage and actually show to this romantic world of the organic that Reformed theology can provide a more robust and more rational, more satisfying organicism than the very people that came up with organicism in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think, Parker, you mentioned, Dr. Van Hooser's work earlier too, and understanding his work. I think whoever you find today who are attacked by both the left and the right, that's someone who is imbibing Bavinck's and Kuyper's organic vision. Because when Bavinck and Kuyper used this kind of language, they were attacked by both left and right. They say, hey, you're sounding like a modern here by those who are more conservative. You've been polluted by Leiden, maybe, or you're too engaged in culture. You got to go back to your Dutch Orthodox roots. But then the more progressive or liberal idealist, theologians and philosophers would say, no, you guys are just talking about this in our language, but you guys are just fundamentalists. You guys are just Calvinists. What are you doing? And I think which theologian and philosopher today are being attacked in the same way? Conservatives are saying you're way too compromising. But then, the more liberal guys are saying you're way too conservative. You're not really one of us.
Yeah.
Who's in that kind of mold? And I do think that kind of theologian that you could think of, I don't know, you could probably name a few, Parker. That's someone who's imbibing that kind of spirit. Yeah. Pastorally, I do think Tim Keller comes to mind, but that's just me.
You just triggered all the audience.
I know.
Well, it's important to say too that as much as the term and the philosophical concept was a product of the post-Enlightenment milieu, that Bavinck also understood the organic idea to just be basically biblical. And you see Kuyper and Bavinck ground so much of their theology in these organism metaphors of the body and its parts, of the leaven, of the mustard seed, of the vine and the branch. So all of these biblical concepts are at the background as well of the organism motif.
So following up on that, then I totally agree that. Well, it's just funny. Here we are talking about Bavinck, and he would probably say, "You guys should have written your own systematic theologies for your modern day. Don't worry about me." But it's like, we are worried about you, man. You laid down the foundation for us. When it comes to the postmodern context, whether we live in it or not, whether we're in a deep modern, there's debate on everything, including that. How do we also appropriate postmodern theologies, postmodern philosophy into our schemas, into our theologies as well? How do we go about using the organic motif in that kind of context? Are there certain ones that are just off limits? Maybe, like feminist theology's out. Putting you guys on the spot, you're going to get just destroyed here if you say something wrong.
Yeah, it's a huge question. And the activity of doing what Bavinck did with the postmodern philosophies, right? And there's so many, is a career-long, lifetime project. And it's difficult to, I think, answer the question in any detail because of that fact. But I think you see examples of this right now. You see James K. Smith a guy who I think has done just that in the spirit of Bavinck has done something very similar. His book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, takes an initial jab at doing exactly some of the things that we're talking about here, learning from postmodernity and the best, and we're talking about the best of postmodernist thinkers. And there are a number of others. I mean, and Kevin Van Hooser as well is one that has, and his work with some of the people like Ricoeur, for example, and others. So people are doing it, and I think it's a very worthy endeavor. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think we can also mention Christopher Watkin at Monash University, and his work on Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, right? And the fact that, the thing is, when you want to do something like what Bavinck is doing, you have to be really, really well versed in that thinker that you want to engage with, and so you want to understand in its own terms and show how theology subversively fulfills, to use Johann Bavinck's term, that particular thinker. And to be honest, if Bonaventure could do that with Plato, Aquinas could do that with Aristotle, so could we with anyone here today, right?
I love that language as well. Subversively fulfill. I'm trying to do that. When we're done here, I got to go write a paper on Donald Davidson. I'm trying to subversively fulfill his triangulation argument in a Bavinckian way. So we'll see if it's successful or not. But so, Cory, you talked about how, in Bavinck's estimation, modern theologies have replaced, they've put apologetics at the head of theological disciplines in order to provide a foundation for theology, and how theology kind of has lost its own principium in the process. Where we're at historically now, I keep on wanting to bring Bavinck back today because I think it's so applicable, but I need help, like thinking through, do we turn back and say we need our own theology, needs its own principia? Let's just, I don't want to say it in a way that diminishes it, but let's kind of just start again. Or do we say, no, this is where we're at, apologetics, philosophy, kind of the start. We'll use the organic motif and subvert stuff and then work our way back. Any thoughts on the place of theological principia and whether we can get back to that or not?
Yeah, well, let me set that maybe in historical context a little bit. I mean, the fact of placing apologetics at the head of dogmatics or systematic theology is a product in the 19th century of responding directly to Kant's separation between knowing and thinking, right? And so for Kant, you can think about God's self in the world, but you can't know God's self or the world. And so what happened was, instead of assuming that theology brings its own sources, you need then, if you're going to try to make theology into an object of knowledge, you have to redefine it and put some other discipline at the head in order to get to a place where you can call it a knowing. What is the object that you're trying to know? Well, apologetics in that context does not mean what we would probably define apologetics as. Apologetics in that context is typically more like sociology. It's trying to say, well, let me show you about the facts of the development of the church in history in order to find a new basis to call theology knowledge. And so, for example, Schleiermacher puts apologetics at the beginning of his work in order to say that the historical church is a church that confesses Jesus Christ of Nazareth consistently throughout its history. And so if we want to develop a theology that's actually knowing something, we can learn and know the consciousness of the historical church in its development. And then we can say, well, what is our current communal consciousness about God as it relates to this history of Jesus Christ of Nazareth? So the object of theology now for him is no longer God, as God has made himself known in his revelation. It is the community, the communal consciousness that gathers together to worship this God. But he's not actually looking at God directly and saying, theology, I'm trying to know God. He's used apologetics, a sociology really, to say that we can look at the community to say things about God.
Wow. That really explains.
Go ahead, sir.
Well, that totally explains why they call him the father of modern liberalism. Like that you can see following that trajectory all the way up to today in mainline churches.
Right. So what happens is when you put apologetics at the head of your work, you're saying that you're saying that God, if you're doing it like a modernist does it, you're saying that God is not the object of knowledge. Is not an object of knowledge. Is not the object of theology.
Yeah.
That's what's happening.
That's really helpful. Yeah. Thanks. Great. Anything to add on that, or?
Amen.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to jump in to a couple random questions as we close up here. Where should people? I meant to do this in the beginning. Where should people start if they want to get into Bavinck? Probably not with Christian worldview, though. Maybe you might say that they should. Where do you guys think they should start?
Probably The Wonderful Works of God, I would say, is a great place to start. It was a book that was written for a working adult that has somewhat of an education, but there it is right there.
Yeah.
There will be there's a translation going on of another short theological summary that was originally written for teenagers that Bavinck did. And that translation project, I believe, is underway right now. Gray might know more, but that will be, when that does come out, that'll be a really great place to start. The title of it is escaping me right now, but
You're
still muted there.
Gray.
Oh, my bad. Yeah, the Handbook of Christian Instruction or something. Yeah, it's going to be translated by Greg Parker and Ken Clausing, I believe.
Yeah, Greg let that slip to me the other day. Yeah, it sounds awesome. It sounds amazing. I wish he wouldn't have, because now I'm just dying to get it out. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, that'll be a great resource. But The Wonderful Works of God right now is a great place to get a summary and a good place to start.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're a theologian philosopher already, then I think philosophy of revelation, Christian worldview, that's where the heavy hitting is.
Yeah. Well, so on that note, Bavinck talks about man as being and becoming, and some Dr. Eglinton kind of pointed to in his work, and then I believe that's in Christian worldview. What do you guys think about that? Do you guys follow him in that thinking? And actually, can one of you parse out why that would be kind of a strange thing to say?
Man as being and becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that comes out in his dogmatics, also in his Christian worldview. I mean, it's pretty ubiquitous, I think, where he says that. I think, that's a way for him to subvert Hegelian logic, where Hegel says that God is being and becoming. Bavinck says God is being, never changing, immutable, simple, and so on. And man is being and becoming, right? So we are the ones who are developing. We are the ones who are depending on the world, right? We are the ones suffering and hence growing teleologically. We are the organisms, in other words, right? Whereas God is not part of the organism. And that's another thing we got to point out, is that Bavinck never describes God as an organism, because God is without parts. God is simple. Yeah. But we are organic. So I think, that's probably what I would say with that. I don't know if you had something else in view, Parker.
Yeah, Cory, do you want to jump in?
I think my understanding of it is that it's a way of saying in modern grammar, Hegelian grammar, that we change and God doesn't, and I think that's all Bavinck really means by that. It's the same thing as talking about the immediate consciousness and the temporal consciousness in that era. So again, immediate consciousness is the identity of the self that is given, right? That does not change. Gray is the same I that he was when he was a 2-year-old as he is right now. He is still that ego. But at the same time, in his temporal consciousness, he's had so many interactions with the world outside of him and within his own development that he is very different now. Not in every way. He's still some ways like a child. No, I'm just kidding. But,
definitely.
But so I think that's all he means by it.
Okay. Well, and that's helpful. To me, when I first read it, I think that Dr. Eglinton kind of put it in the reader's mind, like, oh, this is kind of interesting. And I thought about it. I thought, well, okay, how about my dog? Is my dog purely becoming and no being? Is my being in reference to being an image bearer of God? There's something eternal about me. My eternal soul, even though it has a begin point, has no end point, whereas maybe my dog doesn't have a soul. And my dog is just becoming. Is the rest of creation becoming, and just man is because we're image bearer of God, we are being and becoming? is there anything there, or is he's just using that terminology to talk about immediate consciousness and temporal awareness kind of stuff?
Gray's an expert on animal eschatology, so
Not animals in general, just puppy eschatology. So it's very
Okay.
specific. No,
well, interesting questions.
yeah. I think the answer to that is I don't know. I think it depends on where you view the animal world and self-consciousness with regard to the animal world. And there's probably a debate out there about that.
Yeah, there's a couple of debates out there, especially as people become more and more comfortable with dog mom language. The debates get hotter and hotter. I'm talking with a Christian philosopher about phenomenal consciousness tomorrow, and it's so cool because our conversation today, even though you might pit it more in the continental side, it's finally coming over into the analytic side. People are finally starting to talk about self-consciousness and what it means to be human as being self-conscious versus conscious. And I'm really excited about that debate. And I think Bavinck, it's gonna pop up. He's gonna become even more relevant as that conversation grows.
Absolutely. We had Chris Watkin for our TSDC podcast, and he said I impishly asked what he thought about the analytic continental divide, and he said very wryly, he said the analytic continental divide is so 1990s. He says there's so much more cross-pollination now. I mean, on my shelf there, I think there's a book by, I think, I can't remember his name. I got to look at it, but basically Hegel for analytic philosophy or something, or Hegel after analytic philosophy. And so there's a lot more cross-pollination. Kevin Hector's book, Theology, the Theology of Modernism, I think, for OUP's analytic theology series. Okay. That book is really an exposition of Schleiermacher, Hegel, and Kant in analytic terms. So definitely a lot of cross-pollination. And I think hopefully phenomenology would not be looked at as the boogeyman, as it normally is in the analytic world. And if you take a look at, Heidegger, kind of the first guys who did phenomenology, his education was in Augustine, Bonaventure. I mean, he was actually commenting on these guys as he was studying theology for his, initial studies. So I think there's lots of these roots in the classical tradition, and maybe the whole phenomenology versus analytic, phenomenology versus the classical divide should also be brought down.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I think it's happening, and I'm excited to see Bavinck be put in conversation or be brought back into that conversation as well. I wanted to ask you guys real quick if you could, one of you, both of you, could lay out the different principiums, ascendi, cognoscendi, internum, externum, just for my listeners. It's really cool language, and I don't want them to be scared of that. I want them to grab onto that. Can you guys explain what those terms mean? Maybe what Bavinck meant by them? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's sure. So for Bavinck, the principle of being is God himself. He's the origin of all being, right? And then he has a principle of knowing. So these are the grounds of theology. And the principle of knowing, he subdivides into an internal principle and an external principle. And in all of these ways, in all the principium of theology, really the best way to think about it is that God is the answer. So the principium of knowing externally is God's speech, God's revelation. And so if you think the principium of being itself, you could attribute to the Father, who is the ground of all being, and the principium of knowing externally in Revelation is the work of the Son, who is the Logos, the speech of God. And then there's principium interum, that's the revelation of God's self to the self by the work of the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit receives the speech of the Son, of God through the Son in the human self. And so you have the work of Father, Son, and Spirit ad extra in that revelatory frame that creates the framework of all theology.
That's good. And that ties back in again to the organic motif, because well, as the pithy saying goes, Trinity ad intra, not necessitates, leads to, or Gray, you use it. What is it?
Trinity ad intra implies organism ad extra, something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll probably use different terms here and there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think with the organic motif in place, the principia becomes more flexible too. There is it becomes, I think whereas in some of the more Reformed scholastic uses of it, the Principia is very, very strict. The Principia for theology is this, and the Principia of the other sciences are that. Whereas I think with the organic motif in place, we can freely draw from different Principia without compromising the differing grounds. I think sphere sovereignty plays a role in this too, because each sphere has their own Principia, so to speak, but at the same time there's a unity undergirding the differing spheres of life. So I think there's a more holistic way of using and talking about the Principia here.
Yeah, okay. And so in the organic in viewing, we don't want to say God is organic, but God is unity and diversity in that he is Trinity ad intra. And there we find Van Til says equal ultimacy of unity and diversity. But then Bavinck says in creation there is a priority of the whole against the part. That unity comes first. I'm still kind of curious on that. Is that because like the plan of God is the unity of creation? Like why does he have prioritize whole over parts there?
Yeah, great question. I think if you take a look at RD2, his argument on creation there, he talks about the unity of the will of God, that the Trinity has one will, right? There's no three wills, no order of authority and submission to all of you EFS triggery folks there. No order in Bavinck. There's only one will in God, and that unity of will means there's a unity in creation. For some reason, he really tethers the two here together. And I think that's pretty much in keeping with classical Orthodox doctrine of God and creation. And so with regard to creation, I think definitely the diversity of parts in creation is relativized by, is undergirded by a greater unity that upholds it all. And I think ultimately Bavinck says Christians are better able to account for that unity. Now, I don't think he compromises, equal ultimacy between unity and diversity in God. I mean, Bavinck explicitly says that here and there. But I do think there's something about creation as being the result of the will of God that accounts for the greater emphasis on the unity of the whole.
Okay. That's good, man. I still got to think through that stuff a lot. That's
fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's really good.
It's something that I come back to as well. I mean, somebody yesterday just asked me about that, and I said, I can't remember I wrote that, but I did apparently.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to finish up here with some stuff that I've taken away from you guys' works. And I wrote it really sloppily, but Cory, your work really encouraged me in thinking through what I want to see true evangelicalism look like. Not this orthodox yet modern, and not modern of Bavinck's day, but of our day. That I think evangelicalism, rightly understood, is culturally affirming, transforming, engaging. But yet we have the fundamentals of the fundamentalists, though not their curmudgeonness towards culture. I think that your work actually provides like this way forward through this 100-year-old theologian. I was really, really encouraged by that. And I want to see more people keep that evangelical word. Hopefully it's not too tainted, it's not too far gone, but be evangelicals in the way that Bavinck was an evangelical. And then, Gray Man, your work on epistemology was so encouraging that we don't have to pick a team, and we don't have to, I'm this, and that means that if I'm an internalist, I have to hate externalists and I have to destroy you guys. But we can, in a Bavinckian fashion, hey, there's some stuff that there's this and there's this, and I think it's a little bit more complex, and I'm gonna eat the meat and I'm gonna spit the bones where I need to. So again, that was super, super encouraging. And then something I've seen in both of you guys is that there's this kind of like Schaefferian, following Schaeffer, that there's this line of despair here, and we need to really, if we just would go back before then, everything would be cool. And what I've learned from both of you guys' work is like, there's no going back. We're downstream of this stuff, and it's not necessarily desirable to want to go back. Right. God is sovereign over the whole thing, and he's moving us forward, and armed with the organic motif, like we can be blessed by non-Christian work, and then we can subvert it and show how its true culmination is found in a Christian philosophy of life. So I've been really encouraged by you guys.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Parker. Yeah. That's massive, man. And I think I fear that this looking to the past can become a kind of unhealthy nostalgia.
Yeah.
When I think, as Bavinck says in his modernism and orthodoxy, we are children of our time. Yeah. And there's no ungratefulness. We would be ungrateful, in other words, to God if we were just disdaining everything around us. So I think to be realistic, we have to be children of our time, and to be grateful to the Lord, we have to be cognizant that He's still at work even today.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm really looking forward. I think that we talked about continental and analytic. I think Bavinck can speak into that. I also think that in the coming months and years, we need to have more unity in the church. And I think the organic motif actually, I mean, you guys know it provides the foundation for unity in the church, but not uniformity, as Kuyper says, as Bavinck says. So I'm excited to see some unity and diversity happening in our churches more and more. And I hope that the people will take up Bavinck and apply it to their lives. I loved this conversation. This was awesome. I kept smiling the whole time because this is like a dream come true talking with you guys. I'd love to have you guys back on, talk about your future works, talk more about these works. So just open invitation. Please come back on and school us more on Bavinck and your own thought.
Yeah, thanks, Parker. We'd love to.
Yeah, for sure. This was good fun.
Awesome. Well, that's going to have to do it. We could talk about this more. Lord willing, we're going to someday. But for now, that's it. This has been Parker's Pensées. And as always, all glory to God.